Hello and welcome to this DC Velocity and Supply Chain Exchange webcast. I'm David Maloney, Group Editorial Director. Thanks for joining us. Today's webcast is Warehouse Performance Management, Visibility that Drives Action. In today's complex warehouse environments, data lives in dozens of disconnected systems and across multiple locations, such as warehouse management systems, enterprise systems, robotics, labor tracking system, time clocks, and much more. Having the right data visibility so that you can make smarter decisions in real time is what sets high-performing operations apart. In this webinar, you will learn how top operations leaders are using warehouse performance management to align data, performance, and goals. Our webcast today is presented by Easy Metrics. But before we begin our presentation, here are some tips to help you connect and participate in the webcast. Our webcast is designed to be interactive between you and our presenter, so later in the program, we'll have a question and answer session to allow you to ask our presenter questions relevant to what we discussed today. Just type your question into the text box on the console and click the Submit Question button. And you can submit them at any time during the webcast. You don't have to wait till the very end, and we'll get to as many of those questions as we can during our presentation. The slides will advance automatically throughout the event. If slides are not advancing, try pressing the F5 key or Control-R on your keyboard to refresh your console. We also recommend that you disable your pop-up blockers. And if you're experiencing any technical problems, please visit our webcast help guide by clicking on the help link that's below the media player. Now, to begin our presentation, I'm pleased to introduce our presenter today. Dean Dorcas is the CEO and co-founder of Easy Metrics, a cloud-based business intelligence system that helps companies with labor-intensive operations to identify and optimize their labor costs. I will now turn the floor over to Dean to begin the presentation. Dean?
Excellent. Thank you, David. I appreciate the opportunity to present today. So as you mentioned, today we're going to be talking about warehouse performance management. That's actually a term that was coined by Gartner during a conversation we had with them about a year ago, where we were talking about how labor management has evolved so far in the last few years. And their comment was, we're well beyond labor management. Now we've really moved into the phase of warehouse performance management. So we like that concept and have been building our messaging around that. So as we look at warehouse performance management, really it's about looking at your workflow data, identifying what those key goals are that have to do with the performance of your warehouse, setting those KPIs, capturing the data, which we'll talk a lot about today, analyzing the results, and then using that information to drive continuous improvement, to communicate with your team, etc. As we look at warehouse performance management, there's really four pillars that tie into it. The first one, from an operational profitability, is where we're really going to focus today. That gets into productivity, utilization, waste, etc. But it also includes in there making sure that our orders are accurate, making sure that our deliveries are on time, and making sure that our operations are run in a safe manner. So we're going to go through a lot today, and it can feel pretty overwhelming. So I want to stop before we get into this too far and really just talk about a crawl, walk, run approach. So as we're diving into this, we're going to be pulling in that data, but we're going to go at it in chunks to make sure that it's digestible and really driving the results that we're looking for. So phase one is really the crawl phase. And this is where we talk about this unified data model. And that is just so critical that we look at all the different data sources that are out there that give us visibility into that workflow of what's going on. And then we pull that data together, which we'll talk about. And then that gives us the insights to run everything else on. And I can't really stress the importance of that unified data model enough. And I'll just give you a couple examples. So one of our customers was a large distribution center, and they were using Kronos and Blue Yonder as their data sources. And when they just looked at Kronos, they would see part of what was going on. And an example that we used to get called on a lot from them in the early days, they'd call us and say, our data's wrong. And we'd ask why, and they'd say, well, the employee went 4 hours in box making. Because what happened is the employee was in box making from 8 in the morning, but at 10, that employee got pulled off to go pick a rush order for half an hour, and then came back and finished up on box making, but the employee forgot to log out on Kronos. So Kronos was showing the employee was on box making from 8 to 12, but the WMS data was showing pick scans coming in from 10 to 10:30. So by merging that data in together, getting that unified data model, it now gave us insight into what was actually going on, which was the employee worked on box making from 8 to 10, picking 10 to 10:30, back on box making from 10:30 to 12. So trying to run any of these warehouse performance management deep dive investigations, if you don't have that unified data model, it can be very, very difficult. So that's the first thing that we have to do to put in place to give us that strong data foundation. We'll talk a lot more about that as we go through here. Once that's done, we're still in the crawl phase, this phase one. At that stage, we want to really start focusing on utilization from an employee level. And that's going to be about 50% of the easily quantifiable savings, just right there. And we'll get into a lot of detail of where that comes from and how to harvest that information. But that's going to be your phase one. Phase two, we started getting into more of a traditional labor management approach where we're focused on employee productivity. We'll focus on that a lot. That's going to be your walk phase. And then phase 3 through 5 is really where we get into the run phase of warehouse performance management. That's where we get into the process optimization, managing the profitability or the overall performance across the network, and then starting to tie in robotics as we're moving more and more in that direction. So as we start off doing that unified data model, it's all about the different data sources. And obviously the WMS, time clocks, job codes, those are going to be key in there. But other information, order information, revenue information, telematics off the forklifts, et cetera, are all data that gives us insights into what's going on within the performance of the operation. But the key here is not to approach those in silos. The key is really to go through this normalizing, which is making sure all the data can play together, merging it together, and then once it's all merged together, then running the transformation, running all the calculations. Going back to my example of the box making, once that's merged together, we would know that the employee wasn't 4 hours on box making, he was 3.5 hours on box making. So that normalize, merge, and transform is really a key part of getting to where you have good information that you can start really driving results and costs out of the system. So as we're going through this process, first thing we need to do is fill in any of those gaps. So oftentimes the WMS might have 60% of an employee's time in there. So we want to make sure we're filling in those other gaps through job codes, through other systems. So we know if the employee was paid 8 hours, I need to know everything that employee was doing for the full 8 hours. Once we've got those data sources identified that give us that full visibility, then we go through that normalize, merge, transform process that I talked about. But as we're going through there, we need to make sure that we're correcting for employee errors. And as we all know on this call, employees can make a lot of errors. And that was really driven home to me a number of years ago when we started working with Raymond and their iWarehouse telematics on the forklift. And we started doing that transform, merge, transform of the data. And what we started finding is that about 30% of the time, the employees on job codes on a telematic were logged into the wrong job. They'd be logged into put away, and we'd start seeing pallet pick come in. And so we had to figure out the algorithms in there to correct for that human error. And what we landed on is obviously is the WMS is the source of truth. So if we're getting pick scans, we know the employee's picking even if they're logged into a different job code. But we got to correct for that human error. Once we've gone through that process, now we have a clean, consistent data foundation that we can start running all of these value drivers from. And before we get any farther, just talking about the importance of full visibility. So as I mentioned, the WMS might capture 60% of the work being done out there, so we need to supplement that. But we also want to make sure that we're getting all of the processes captured. And oftentimes we'll have customers say, I just want to focus on those 3 main processes because that's where the majority of my labor is. But when that happens, you start losing a lot of the visibility. Costs can start slipping into other areas. And I'll just give you a simple example. One of our earlier customers, when we first started, we rolled out the system everywhere, but they didn't want to roll it out within their value-added area. They just thought it was too complex, too much variability. So we didn't have any visibility into the VAS. Fast forward into the year, we're looking at our reports. We went to them all excited and we said, hey, we're showing we saved you 16% of your labor costs. And they said, we're not seeing it in our financials, we're seeing about a 1% increase. So as we looked at why, we found out what happened is in all the areas that were being tracked, in the regular warehouse, productivity went up, costs went down. We did capture that 16% savings, but the majority of the workers that were freed up because of the increased productivity were all shifted over to VAS. And so the VAS costs went up significantly, wiped out the vast majority of the profit. Once we identified that, we tied VAS into the system, and the next year they did achieve that 16% increase in productivity. But I think that every time a customer says, I just want to focus on these areas, but not these other areas, capturing that full visibility is really critical. The other area we hear this sometimes is, I only want to focus on my big distribution centers, not those small ones. And having that full visibility is still really important across all of your operations. Maybe we're not going to go as deep into multi-metric labor standards, some of the things we'll talk about today, but getting that visibility across the network, being able to benchmark, being able to understand where everything's going is really key to deriving the full value from the system. All right, so a few important factors as we're developing that unified data model. Obviously, it always starts with the data. That's the key on this whole thing. We've got those multiple disparate data sets. We need to make sure that we're pulling all those in. And as we're doing that, as we're designing this, a really critical component is get all the key stakeholders involved up front. And traditional labor management obviously tends to be much more of an operations tool. So in our early days, we would focus with the operators. We get them everything they needed, but fast forward a couple of years, the finance team would realize we've got a lot of really interesting data, interesting insights to get into cost, into performance, et cetera. And they'd start asking for some information that our system could give to them, but we hadn't set it up that way initially. So we hadn't configured it that way. So we configured it, but we lost 2 years of historical data. So what we learned from that is early on, as you're starting down the configuration, the scoping, make sure not only do you have operations in there and what their key drivers are, but we've also got the finance people in there and what they're going to use that information to drive, whether it's profitability, cost, pricing, et cetera. And then also engineering. They have a whole different set of tools and factors and metric ratios, et cetera, that they want to use this data to be able to capture. So let's get everybody involved early on as we're designing that unified data model, as we're configuring the system so that it's set up to give every one of the personas the key information that they're going to be using going forward. Obviously, security is going to be a key factor on all this, especially for our larger customers as we're looking across the network, especially if it's global, making sure that everybody's got information coming in, it's all utilized, it's all secure. I can see the entire network from a comparison standpoint if I want to look at that. And then finally, having a mindset of standardization. So sometimes customers will look at it and almost let the sites configure their own system. And every site is different, we get that, and you do need to be flexible in there. But we want to make sure that we're setting it up in a way that is going to give us that benchmarking, is going to give us that those insights across a network. And so we want to take a network standardization mindset and then make those customized adjustments as needed so that we're set up in a way that really is going to drive the level of insights that we're going to go into a lot more detail on today. So those are some of the key factors as we're designing this.
Dean, I see you're going to be addressing artificial intelligence next. And of course, there's plenty of talk about AI within our industry, and many companies are looking at deploying AI, but are struggling to find out how to really gain value from it. What have you seen that works? And do you have any advice on how to actually drive value from AI systems?
Yeah, you're definitely hearing a lot of excitement, hype, questions around AI out there. And one thing that we've heard a lot is that supply chain is really struggling right now to drive value from AI. And I believe the reason for that gets back to that unified data model. It's not a tooling issue, but if I take AI tools and I plug it into a siloed data source, it's not going to be able to give me that real level of insight that I'm looking to achieve from that. So getting that unified data model in place, everything we just talked about, and then plugging the AI tools into it, there is so much, I like to call them nuggets of gold buried out there in the workflow data. AI is a great way of being able to achieve that. And we really do think that AI is going to be what unlocks the ability for customers and companies to leverage the warehouse performance management systems to really be able to pull out that information, pull out those insights. But you need that unified data model in order to be able to achieve that. And I think that's right now where the industry's struggling is I can't just plug it into different things and expect the insight if that data is not AI ready. All right, so that's a high-level overview. Let's go ahead and dive into some more specific details on how we're actually going to start capturing some of the value from this. So as we talked about in that 5-phase slide, we're really going to capture the value by reducing waste. That's going to be both from a employee and a process and equipment standpoint. We're going to increase productivity. We're going to manage our financial performance better. And then as we look at robotic investments, automation investments, we're going to optimize that and make sure that we're driving those savings that we're hoping to achieve. All right, as I mentioned, employee utilization is the low-hanging fruit. That's the easiest area that we want to capture. So when we look at that, it's really broken out into a couple different areas. And missing time is by far and away the easiest low-hanging fruit out there. And what we find is missing time, there's about an hour per day per employee when you first start tracking of missing time. So that's pretty significant. And you ask, where does that come from? What goes into that? So missing time is really the time where I'm paid 8 hours, I'm on direct processes for 6 hours, I'm on indirect processes for an hour. So I've got 7 hours of tracked work. Might not be direct value add work, but I'm working 7 hours. But one of those hours, I'm not working at all. I'm not doing anything. And we find that come in little chunks throughout the day. So I might have a startup meeting at 6 o'clock. It's a 15-minute startup meeting. So we expect to start seeing at 6:15 activity, but there's no activity till 6:35. So right there, I had 20 minutes of missing time. We see the same thing before lunch, after lunch, end of the day, these chunks of time. We also sometimes see it in the middle of the day where maybe I'm picking and I have pick scans at 10, 10:01, 10:03, 10:05, but my next pick scan is not till 10:25. So I know I wasn't picking in there. I shouldn't have had a 20-minute gap. I wasn't on a break, et cetera. So that was time maybe I was talking to my buddy about the football game this weekend. So when we start identifying those little gaps of time, start benchmarking that and using that to drive waste out, you can start usually driving somewhere between 15, 30 minutes a day on the low end of that missing time out of the operation. We were at ProMat, gave a presentation with NLS, one of our customers, a 3PL up in Canada, and they were talking about how they use the system. And the comment they made is they reduced that missing time by 16% by really driving that level of savings. So low-hanging fruit, easy to get, definitely the place we want to start. From there now, we have the employees that are working on an optimal level, they're working full time. Now we want to start getting them working on the value-added process as much as possible. And that's where this indirect cost comes in. So we want to minimize those indirect costs. And to minimize the indirect costs, that's where visibility comes in key. And the one thing I found time and time again is operators, once they gain visibility, they usually say, I had no idea how much money I was spending on indirect until I got visibility into it. But it's also where benchmarking really comes in. So if I'm spending 4% on some indirect process, is that good? Is that bad? I don't really know. But if I see the other sites in the network, they've got theirs down to 2%, that gives me visibility on where I can focus and try to drive some of that waste out of the operation. One of our customers, it's a 3PL. I gave a presentation with them a while ago, and they shared this statistic that I thought was really interesting. They took their indirect at one of their operations from 39% down to 27%. So that's a 12% reduction in indirect costs, 12% reduction in labor costs, and it saved them $400,000 a year. So getting that level of visibility, once again, this is low-hanging fruit. It's not hard to drive that waste out of the system. I'm not asking employees to work any harder. I'm just asking them to minimize where they're on non-value-added time, getting that visibility, being able to benchmark it across other sites, figure out what is achievable, and then drive down into that. One other story I'll tell on this, just because I love this story. One of our customers was looking at battery changes across their network, and they found out that one of their operations had twice the cost in battery changes than everybody else. When they looked into why, they found out that the the forklift operators have figured out if we all take the same break or do the battery change at the same time, there's going to be more of us than battery change stations, and we're going to get an extra break out of it. So once they identified that, they set up a schedule for battery changes, and they're able to drive that cost back down to the level of the rest of the network. All right, so we've talked about eliminating waste from an employee standpoint, but the flip side of the coin is eliminating waste from a process standpoint. And it doesn't matter if I've got employees that are working super hard, they're all at 100% of their labor standard. If they're doing very inefficient processes, then I'm wasting a lot of money. So I might have them running around, but if they're going out to the annex and they're traveling very far for doing the work, then there's a lot of waste there. And this is where, as we start moving beyond just traditional labor management and really start leveraging cost to serve, leveraging metric ratios, and identifying where I have inefficient processes out there, now my engineering team can really start focusing on identifying where those opportunities are, stack ranking, where do we want to put our resources, focusing on making improvement, and then driving those changes. So an example that we walked through in one of our demos where we go into actual customer data, we can see a process, looking at it from a cost to serve standpoint. I've got a process where the cost of this one operation is about 50% higher to do put away than it is in my other operations. As you drill down into the metric ratios why, you find out that we're traveling twice as far to put away a pallet at that operation and the other operations, and that travel distance has slowly increased over the last year. And so perfect example of getting that information, identifying where there's opportunity, having the engineers go in and figure out if there's a way to get that cost driven out of the system. So reducing waste from a continuous improvement standpoint can be very powerful. So as I mentioned, cost to serve is key from a process improvement, continuous improvement standpoint. It's also key as we start looking into profitability and some of the things we'll talk about. But how do we get to accurate information? So the problem with cost to serve oftentimes is we're taking averages. So a simple example, let's say that I've got 10,000 lines that are picked. I spent $10,000. So on average, I'm averaging $1 per line. But that doesn't necessarily mean that all lines are costing me $1. I might have some customers that are costing me 20 cents a line. Other customers are costing me $2 a line. And so understanding what the true cost of that is what really starts opening up the power of the system. That's where activity-based costing comes in. It actually looks at the time for every scan, what you did, how far you traveled, what the cost is, and takes that into consideration, gives you a lot of good insight. The problem with activity-based costing, obviously, is try to do that in spreadsheets. It's going to be incredibly difficult, complex, and that's why activity-based costing, or ABC, tends to have a very bad name in the market, is because of the complexity and effort that goes into it. So automating all that is key, but if you can automate that, now you really have powerful information to drive savings from. So another example, one of our customers that, kind of my favorite example of how they use this is they looked at it from picking and they wanted to break that down further. So they broke it down when we pick shoes versus when we pick apparel. But then they want to go deeper. When we pick shoes, what's my cost when it's for an e-commerce order, a specialty retailer, or a big box retailer? So that's a whole different order profile, different cost structure in there. But then they took it even farther and they said, our specialty retailers, these guys are always asking us to expedite an order, or rush an order. So we put a flag in the system and said, okay, if it's a rush order, I want to track it separately, and I want to apply activity-based costing to that. And what we found is the rush orders for those specialty retailers were costing twice as much as a regular order. So they took that information, went back to their inside sales team, and adjusted how and when they're letting the customers, get free expedited orders on there. So the concept can apply to a lot of different things, especially when we start looking at 3PL billing. But the key is really understanding what those costs are and not making your decisions based on averages. All right, so moving on, as everybody knows, we've all been to ProMat, probably seen football fields of robotics out there. Lots going on there. I don't think robotics is in the near future replacing labor 100%, but I think labor plus automation is going to be really key for that. So understanding what my labor costs are, understanding what the cost of the equipment, the robots are, and really start figuring out where the optimal balance is, where I want to make those investments. So a simple example, let's say I've got the Dallas DC, they're fully manual and it's costing $1 per unit to do that work. Over in Atlanta, we decided we're going to test out some robots in there. We put the robots in there. Labor drops from $1 down to 50 cents. My AMRs cost me 20 cents a unit. So now I've gone from $1 fully manual to 70 cents labor plus automation. So it seems like that was a good investment. I'm getting a good ROI. I can now calculate how long it is to get that payback, et cetera. And now I can start looking at my other operations. I now know what my cost is. I know their volume. I can start figuring out where that should fall within that ROI roadmap for the robotics. And then equally important, as I start rolling that out, am I capturing that savings? Because that's certainly something we hear a lot out there right now is, I rolled out robotics and I didn't get the savings that I thought I was going to get. Sometimes it's a home run and sometimes it's not. So why, if I'm not getting savings, why? What's the impact? What do we need to do differently, et cetera? So having that information in there from a cost to serve is really critical to try to optimize and drive as much waste out of the system as we can get to. Okay, so we've talked about eliminating waste. Now let's move on to increasing productivity. So once again, this is definitely much more of a traditional labor management area. But the key on increasing productivity is the multi-metric labor standards. And what I've seen time and time again, if I'm using units per hour, single metrics, I end up getting what we call the yeah buts. And the yeah but's going to be, Bob, your productivity was low. And Bob can say, yeah, but you gave me the small choppy orders. Yeah, but I had to travel back to the annex to pick orders. Yeah, but I was in a meeting, whatever it is. If they have a legitimate reason why their performance might not have been effective, then I've lost my power as a supervisor to try to drive productivity higher. So getting that in place is really critical. Once I have good labor standards in place, and there are no easy jobs, hard jobs, good orders, bad orders, et cetera, now I can work with employees to try to drive productivity higher. And obviously employee coaching is going to be key on that. As we all know out there right now, it's a tight labor market. I can't just fire everybody that doesn't hit the right numbers, because most likely I'm not going to get anybody better coming in. So I want to work with my team, really help them be successful, help show them what best practices are, give them positive feedback, et cetera. So really that employee coaching helps grow my employees into the role. From there, what we've seen is pay for performance can be an incredibly powerful booster to continue to drive that productivity higher and to drive down that unit cost of labor. So getting pay for performance set up, once we've got all those other things in place, we've got a lot of the waste driven out of the system, et cetera. Now I put that in place, and that can really turbocharge things.
Dean, you're talking about pay for performance. Are there some key factors for a pay for performance system to really be effective?
Yeah, so our background, David, before we started Easy Metrics, we used to run distribution centers for some of the large retailers. And pay for performance was a key component, since we were doing it all on a fixed price bid, a key component to drive productivity higher. And in fact, we developed Easy Metrics for our own internal operations there. And one of the operations we were managing was a Walmart facility where we doubled the productivity. And the pay for performance was absolutely critical for it. But I've also seen pay for performance do nothing, or sometimes even cause problems. And I like to say pay for performance is like playing with dynamite. It can be an incredibly powerful tool in your hand, or it can blow up in your hand. And so how we set that up is really critical. And I would say a few of those things that go into that. First one is we talked about those multi-metric labor standards. If pay for performance is not considered fair in the minds of employees, you might as well not do it. If they think that Sally got the good job because the supervisor likes her, I got the bad job because the supervisor doesn't like me, and there's no way I'm going to hit bonus, now it's caused more problems than it's worth. Or if they feel like my bonus is going to be just based on whatever order profile I get for the day, I might as well not try. I might get a bonus, might not get a bonus. So multi-metric fair labor standards are absolutely critical. In fact, we generally will not put PFP in place for a customer if they want to do single metric labor standards because of that problem. So that's one of the key drivers. Second driver is going to be what we call lock-in period, which is how long do I need to achieve that level of productivity in order to earn a bonus? And daily is incredibly powerful. That's our preferred approach. Weekly can be very effective as well, and there's certain situations where I highly recommend that. You start getting up into monthly and well, I wouldn't even consider beyond monthly, but it really loses a lot of its power at that stage, and I just see it not getting traction. The same thing goes to team size. So pay for performance based on an individual or small team, 3, 4 employees can be incredibly powerful. You start trying to roll out teams of 15, 20, and it just doesn't have the impact because I can't change everybody else's performance at that level. Once again, it becomes a lottery ticket. So you tie those things in, it really helps get the traction. And the last thing is making sure that it's designed economically effectively. I've seen some companies design pay for performance where if the productivity goes up, it's actually going to cost them more money. So you want to make sure you're designing a way that you're sharing the savings fairly with the employees. If you're trying to drive retention, you might give them a higher percentage of savings. If you're trying to lower your unit cost of labor, you might give a little more of the savings to the company, but being very intentional on how you're designing the program. But if you set it up the right way, it can be incredibly powerful. And then the final thing I'll talk about from a productivity standpoint is Intraday. And Intraday is an incredibly powerful tool once a company is mature in how they're using the system. So what I don't recommend is necessarily setting up on day one if your supervisors have never used a labor management type system before, because it's just overwhelming. It's just too much information. They can get caught up in some of the minutia and leave a lot of low-hanging fruit on the table. So get a good cadence going, use the data on a daily basis. Once you're ready to take that next step, then tying in Intraday and having almost every few minutes the data refresh, that's really powerful to start knowing where there's opportunities, where there's waste, where you want to address it, training, everything else. So Intraday is great, but make sure it's not, going back to crawl, walk, run, make sure that's not your crawl solution. So we talked a lot about the importance of multi-metric labor standards. The challenge you can run into is multi-metric labor standards can be very expensive to set up and to maintain. And so the temptation for companies is to slip back into single metric units per hour, lines per hour, et cetera. As we talked about, that's just a non-starter in most operations. It's just not going to give you the level of visibility and control that you need, and fairness, et cetera. So we have a module called Standard 1 that does a deep dive into all the metrics, the multi-metrics in there, and helps develop very fair and tight labor standards, not only to set them up initially, but more importantly, to make sure that they don't become obsolete. And so most of our customers either use those tools as a standalone, or in an ideal scenario, they use it along with an engineer to really help that engineer do them much faster, much quicker, and leverage a lot of information that engineer is not necessarily going to see while they're walking on the floor. So the key thing here is, however you get to labor standards, make sure they don't become obsolete. The one area I've seen labor management, especially pay for performance, fail is when labor standards become obsolete. That's gonna kill the system. So you got to keep it up and running. So if you're going into a scenario, have that in mind. How am I going to make sure that I'm keeping my standards up to speed? All right, as we move on to profit management, this is as we're getting further along on that maturity curve. So we already have the performance, we have the cost. Now let's tie in the revenue from a 3PL and understand what my profit is across my network by facility, drill down by customer within that facility, drilling all the way down into that billing trigger. So the key here is, real time. I want to see immediately how I'm doing and not wait till a month being over. And I want to identify an issue and then quickly be able to drill down to that root cause, even further down into the metric ratios to understand what might be driving that root cause issue. and then take action accordingly. So as an example, from a profit management standpoint, being able to look and say, okay, I'm losing money at this facility. Why? I'm losing money on this customer. Why? Okay, I'm losing money on the inbound billing trigger. Why am I losing money there? It's not my unloading. It's not my put away. Oh, look at how much QC we're doing at that process at this level that we're not billing for. That's what's keeping us from being profitable. So real-time drill down so I can take corrective action is incredibly powerful. It also helps give you a kind of standardized way of managing the performance across a network. And this starts applying even if you're not a 3PL, you're more of a cost center, but being able to tell which operations are running well, not running well, that takes all that into consideration. So an example, a customer a number of years ago, they looked at a single unit metric and all their facilities were doing really, really well, but one facility had just fallen off the cliff. It looked like their performance was horrible. Their cost to get a unit out the door had skyrocketed. And when we looked into why, we found out that they had lost their biggest customer, replaced them with a bunch of smaller customers, and they're doing twice as much work to get a unit out the door, traveling twice as far to get a unit out the door than they were before. And so it wasn't a performance or a management issue, it was really an order profile issue. So an overall performance metric that looks at the work being done, gives you credit for that, ties that against the cost that you're spending in there as if you were a 3PL. Now gives you that standard way to look across my network, apples to apples, look within a site over time, how things are changing, and do it in a way that takes into consideration those changes or differences in order profile, labor costs, et cetera. All right, so we're getting close to wrapping up here. As we look at the network dashboards, I can't stress the importance of network visibility enough. And what network visibility allows you to do, one, from a benchmarking standpoint, understanding what is the right amount of time I should be spending on housekeeping or battery changes or the different indirect processes. So where are there potential savings? If I'm a general manager and I see I'm running 6%, but some of these operations are running 3%, I might reach out to them and try to find out, what are you doing to get your cost down to that level? Because boy, if I could drive 3% of my cost out, that would be great. So it gives you that standard. It can also be helpful on a direct process standpoint, although a little less so. But it's also key from what we've seen on a change management standpoint. So another way that labor management tends to fail is it's a tool, it has to be used. If the supervisors don't log in, you're just not going to drive a lot of results. When you start getting that network visibility, you start getting a lot more buy-in. You're obviously making good decisions strategically, but you're also being able to benchmark, you're being able to see what's going on, and it gets everybody much more engaged to use the tools. And just one example, one of our customers, we rolled out the first site, and we just weren't getting a lot of buy-in from the general manager there. We showed up to do training, the general manager headed out to play golf. But once we got the rest of the site starting to come on, the network dashboards on there, now you started getting full engagement. Everybody was focused on it. How are we doing against the other sites? And you got that executive level visibility buy-in, and it just really changed the game out there. So the network dashboards are powerful from a change management standpoint, a benchmarking standpoint. And then if I am that VP of the West Coast region, I want to know quickly as I'm walking through the airport, how are my sites doing? If there's an issue, I want to be able to quickly drill down, give that GM a call. What's going on? What's the plan here? I see we're behind. That GM has the same information. Yep, here's my strategy. Here's what we're doing. And it just keeps everything running a lot more efficient. All right, so wrapping up the whole leveraging the unified data model. The first step is getting that overall performance metric in place, whether it's profit for a 3PL or that overall performance metric we talked about for cost centers. But whatever it is, it needs to accommodate the differences and changes in that product mix. So we have a fair apples to apples comparison across the sites. Once that's in place, we want to have the ability to quickly drill down into real time to discover the root cause issues. And we want to be able to see how things are changing over time. So that way we can identify, going back to my example, we're traveling too far. We've always traveled too far. Oh, it might be a building issue. Oh, no, it looks like we started traveling slowly, increasing over the last 6 months, okay, we're just time for refresh. From there, now we have that information in place. Now we want to really start managing to those KPIs. So effectiveness is a great KPI that looks at basically how much value did we create for the labor standards we have. It takes into consideration all the changes in product mix, et cetera, that we talked about. Throughput cost per unit can be useful if my product mix order profile doesn't change. And then profitability obviously is a key driver there that looks at the actual work being performed and compares that against the cost. We want to look at it from productivity, as we talked about, that missing time, really low hanging fruit there. Quickest way to drive 5–10% of cost out of the operation is just focus on that missing time. Guarantee if you don't have job codes, if you haven't been managing that way, you probably got a fair amount of those little gaps popping up throughout the day. The utilization, getting the time spent on value-added processes to the optimal level, lots of savings potential there. Looking at it from a process, cost to serve on a process standpoint, let's really get the continuous improvement kicked into gear, give them the information they need so our processes are as optimal as possible, and then managing the overtime and driving that down. So once we have all that in place, now really looking at it from that granular level, that the metric ratios, really understanding what's driving those low performance or where that opportunity is, so we can come up with a game plan on how to take that waste out of the operation. And David, that's all I had today to go through. I'll turn it back over to you, see if we have any questions out there.
Great. Thank you, Dean. Nice work on that presentation. It is time for us to move into the question and answer portion of our webcast. And if you did not yet have a chance to send in your question, now's the time to do it. Just go ahead and type it into the console, submit it to us, and we'll get to as many of those questions as we can. When I did the opening, I mentioned that data exists in a lot of different places, Dean. Warehouse management systems, enterprise systems, time clocks, robotic systems, that sort of thing. Yet those systems rarely talk to each other, and this question addresses that. So what are the risks that come with relying on siloed data, and how does a unified model help leaders make better daily and long-term decisions?
Yeah, I'd say if you think about it from a risk standpoint, siloed data is only telling you half the story. And so, simple example, let's say that I'm looking at an employee and I just look at the WMS data and I think, wow, that employee didn't do many units today. That's going to be a limited information. That might be true, but if I can pull in all the other data and look at it together, I might find out, oh, the employee was off doing some training, or the employee was in a meeting, or the employee had those hard orders that we gave him because he's a top employee and he's going to handle those hard orders better. So it might tell a very different story. So you got to be careful on making decisions based on a lack or an inaccurate amount of data. You know, another example, going back to the profit management, I might look at my customers within an operation. If I'm a 3PL, and I might feel that this customer is profitable because my average cost is X and I'm billing them X plus. But if I actually look at the true cost of doing the work itself, I might find that I'm losing money. But I wouldn't know that if I was just looking at a siloed data source. So when you can merge those data sources together, then transform them, then run your analytics, it often tells a very different story than a single data source is going to tell you by itself.
That makes sense. During your presentation, you talked about KPIs, key performance indicators, and how can operations leaders focus on the KPIs that actually drive efficiency and improvement, and also avoid chasing numbers that don't really move any kind of performance?
So I'd say that comes back to that multi-metric labor standards, and well, let me take it up a little bit. So you've got effectiveness. If I am managing a supervisor or a facility, I'm probably going to be focused on my effectiveness, which is going to look at my utilization plus my productivity. So that tells me how we're utilizing the resources that we're giving. If I take it down to an employee level, I'm really going to focus on the productivity. But once again, I need to make sure that I have fair labor standards, which often require the multi-metric standard. If I am chasing units per hour, I can end up getting down the valley of yeah buts that we talked about, and thinking that I've got an issue, but as I find out, I maybe don't have an issue, and over here I have an issue I'm not even aware of. So getting that in place helps me really focus on the key things that are going to drive results versus going off on a lot of tangents that might not be accurate.
Great. Of course, you dealt a lot with labor and working with the employees that you have and getting them to be productive. So this question kind of addresses some of that. How can warehouse performance management give supervisors and frontline teams the visibility that they need to build a culture of fairness and accountability, and in turn improve safety, retention, and employee engagement?
So you mentioned fairness, accountability. Once again, multi-metric labor standards are critical there from a fairness standpoint. And from an accountability, if I don't have fair standards, I can't get to accountable. So if I have those in place, now I can start doing the employee coaching, et cetera. I can create an environment of fairness. There's nothing worse if I'm an employee to be beat up on something that's not fair. I've got my yeah buts, and they're legitimate yeah buts. And so that's critical from that standpoint. The other one I think you talked about was engagement, retention, quality, and safety. For me, that ties a little bit more into the pay for performance side. I like, there's a stick and the carrot. I like the carrot in that I've got a goal to achieve. If I achieve that goal, I'm going to share in some of those savings. That's going to get me motivated. We tie in a quality and a safety kind of feedback factor in there. So if I drive up productivity, but I'm climbing on boxes to get there and operate in an unsafe manner, or I'm ripping through orders and I'm getting a lot of chargebacks and audit issues, I'm not going to get a bonus based on that. So it tends to get people. What I find with pay for performance is productivity goes up, but quality and safety actually go up as well. Because one, it can impact their bonus, but two, they're more intentional. They're thinking through how they're doing things. They're not just going through the motions, daydreaming. And so they tend to make a lot less errors as well. And going back to our days of running as a 4PL, our turnover, once we got a good employee in place that was earning bonuses, we never lost that employee because they were respected. They were making above market wages. They were being recognized for their hard work, and it just really created a great culture.
That makes a lot of sense. Thank you. I'm sorry to say we are out of time for any more questions. If we didn't get to your questions, or if you don't have a chance to send it to us, go ahead and still submit it, and we can have somebody follow up with you directly with an answer to your question. And again, we encourage you to go to easymetrics.com also to learn more about what we've talked about today. Also, check out the resources tab that's on your console. Just click on the resources, and we've got a couple of goodies in there for you, so you can even learn more about what we talked about today. Again, that's at the resources tab. Shortly after this live event, you'll receive an email reminder to access the presentation on demand, so you can view it once more, or you can also share it with a colleague. And Dean, thanks again for a great job. You really did well on that presentation, and it was a very informative session. So thank you, sir.
Excellent. Thank you, David.
And we'd also like to thank our viewers for being with us. We know your time is valuable, and we appreciate that you chose to spend part of your day watching this webinar. From all of us at DC Velocity and Supply Chain Exchange, I'm Dave Maloney. Have a great rest of your day.
Thank you.